Good morning. I'm standing here in Queen's College, Cambridge, one of the oldest and most elegant colleges of this university, and behind me you should be able to see the mathematical bridge spanning the River Cam, which gives its name to the town. Now the bridge has a very special significance because legend has it that it was put up without any nuts and bolts, that it was just the geometry and the pressure of the angles which held the bridge up. Then in the 17th century, a group of students from the Faculty of Mathematics decided that they'd take it to pieces to find out just how it worked. Unfortunately, when they put it together again, they couldn't make it stand up, and so had to put nuts and bolts in it. Our interest lies really on the other side of the bridge, so we'll go across to one of the most elegant courtyards that Cambridge University has to offer. We're now standing in Cloister Court, which for me is one of the most elegant and prettiest courtyards in Cambridge University. It was built when the college was founded in 1448, which always amuses me because this was during the lifetime of the great Valencian poet Ausiàs March. The connection that I want to make with Valencia, however, is of a different nature, because here, from 1510 to 1515, we could count on the presence of Erasmus of Rotterdam, one of the great intellectuals of the Reformation. Erasmus was here as Professor of Divinity, but he detested Cambridge. He complained that the wine was tasteless, the beer was warm, the weather was cold, but worst of all were the women, who were completely unkissable. Now if we look just behind from where I'm standing, we'll be able to see the room which he occupied when he was in Cambridge. If you look at the very top, just in between the roof on the right hand side and the chimney on the left, you can see the room that Erasmus occupied, and you can understand why he felt so isolated. It wasn't, however, that he was isolated in terms of intellectual company. Jakob Bronowski has talked about the democracy of the intellect that Erasmus shared here in his conversations with the great philosophers of the time, noticeably John Fisher and Thomas More, who both ended up beheaded by the monarch Henry VIII. In his essay on the intellectual in Dictionary for the Idle, Fuster sets out the qualities he admired so much in Erasmus, and these are very much the qualities which Fuster himself embodied. The qualities are, of course, an integrity of academic purpose. The author will write from a purely ethical position. The inquiry and investigation will be based on scientific principle, those principles of observation, interpretation which lead to hypothesis, which is then tested by experiment and subsequent analysis of the results. This procedure is the opposite of prejudice, or what we know as second-hand knowledge or received wisdom. And where is it that we'll receive this type of wisdom? Well, in those values we accept unquestioningly, those which are often promoted by the family, by our education system, but especially by the government and its media. The formula could be applied to Fuster himself, of course, who consistently refused affiliation to any particular party or dogma, either socialism, communism, conservatism, or even Catholicism. The intellectual can only be faithful to his own art. Indeed, it is precisely this which guarantees his independence. Two qualities, then, identify the good scholar: freedom and independence of thought, and the quality of his creation, which will underwrite or guarantee this independence. When we think of Fuster, this fulano de Sueca, as he liked to refer to himself, we tend to think of only Valencia. But let's consider his association with the wider world, with the intellectuals in the rest of Europe. And one who I find particularly close to Fuster in his line of reasoning and thought is, of course, the English writer George Orwell. In many ways, their thought process is indistinguishable. Just look at the similarity in this area. And notice again how Orwell insists on the quality of style as a protection against the imposition of established values and the danger of accepting received wisdom. If people cannot write well, they cannot think well. And if they cannot think well, others will do their thinking for them. The words could be from Fustel himself. Right, that's enough of theory and comparison. Let's take an example of Fustel's technique and put him to the test. Let's see how he goes about dismantling received wisdom. And an excellent place to start is with his first definition in the dictionary, which is, appropriately, love. From the Beatles to Adele, love is everywhere. It is, of course, the basic principle which moves our society. In music, in cinema, in television, soap operas, and, most importantly, in art. Love invades our daily experience totally. So much so, in fact, that we never stop to question its legitimacy. To this effect, Fustel tests us by an experiment, starting with a provocative statement. Love? An invention of the 12th century? Really? The first thing to note is, of course, the style. In order to arouse the reader's interest, Fustel begins with a real headline grabber, a short, arresting statement or aphorism. Its brevity challenges the comfort of those huge things which we take for granted, all those big issues like love, nation, religion, politics, which we're never really meant to criticize. But let's also study the scientific basis behind Fustel's methodology. Where is his evidence for such an enormous statement? Well, Fustel takes us through the history of this concept over the past 4,000 years, and we're stunned to find, after example after example, loving is a pattern of behaviour which was invented by the troubadours in the 11th century, which was subsequently passed down to future generations unquestioningly since then. We know that there have been great lovers. Antony and Cleopatra would be an example from antiquity, but all the others tend to belong to the realm of myth. It's not really until the modern age, after the troubadours, that we get renowned lovers like Romeo and Juliet, Werther, etc., erupting onto the scene and acting like models for our behaviour. In English, of course, the vocabulary indicates this very origin. We talk about courting a young lady. To pay court, of course, from the court of the nobles of ancient Provence, which gave rise to the troubadours and their philosophy. But how has this means of behaviour been passed down to the public at large today? The answer, of course, is precisely through literature and the arts, particularly the theatre, which connect so instantaneously with the mass public. This infection, because that's what we might call it, the spread of this infirmity of love from the intellectual elite to the public at large, was then further empowered by the novel form, which reached the masses, as we know from our study of Dickens and the popularity of the realist and naturalist novelist. The challenge to our beliefs is, of course, astonishing. And if literature is precisely the determinant of the way we act, How ironic, as Fuster concludes, that our behaviour should be dictated by something that we might not even have read. Such is the theory, but like all scientific statements, it should be put to the test, and Fuster would be the first to agree with me. So let's experiment, like the Fulano de Sueca. If love is a behaviour, a pattern which has been passed down from generation to generation since the 12th century, then its footprint, i.e. its characteristics of the 12th century, will be apparent in our everyday life today. How can we examine this? Well, what I propose is to examine it quite simply in the comparison of the lyrical expression of the 12th century and the lyrical expression of today. And what is the lyrical expression of today but the top 20, or as it's known in this country, the hit parade? Now, I'll just take one example, though there are many more. Conventionally speaking, the beloved is treasured, is prized, is the most beautiful and valuable of all creatures. This was certainly true in the Middle Ages, and I think we'll find it's true today. Let's look at this comparison between some verses of Petrarch and verses of the modern era as intoned by Robbie Williams.
Quante volte diss'io allor pien di spavento, costei per fermo nacque in paradiso, così carco d'oblio il divin portamento, e il volto e le parole e il dolce riso m'aveano, e sì diviso dall'imagine vera, chi dicea sospirando, qui come venn'io o quando, credendo essere in ciel, non là dov'era.
The similarity is scary. The sentiments are virtually identical. And I could bring a dozen more similar examples. In this case, 1,000 years may have passed, but the feeling is still the same. An emotion invented by troubadours is as much lived in today as 1,000 years ago. For Robbie, just as for Petrarch, the beloved, the object of desire is so beauteous, so spiritually uplifting as to be divine or angelic in the case of Robbie Williams. And this will make us think, to what extent is our emotion, when channeled in this way, authentic? Does it really come from deep inside? Or is it merely a formula, a pattern which we imitate without really thinking? The dismantling of received wisdom is also typical of the work of another great Valencian. I'm referring, of course, to Vicente Andrés Estellés. And curiously, Estellés also deconstructs and demythifies in the area of love. Ausias Marc, of course, had sprayed the first graffiti on the wall of the establishment with his marvellous declaration of how he was going to leave aside the style of the troubadours, not just their style of writing, but their style of behaviour. He's not talking about any angel like Robbie Williams. His woman is of flesh and blood. He personalises her to such an extent that he even gives her a name, Teresa. Estellés carries on with this process of humanization. Woman is no longer merely an object of desire or a paragon of virtue or a divine being. The relation is no longer pure and ideal, but personal, earthy, intimate, and, most important, passionate. It would, of course, be difficult to think of a more intense declaration of love between two individuals than Estellés' statement that Valencia had never seen a pair of lovers like himself and his wife. It goes against all the dilettante aspect of love and its intellectual ramifications. What's interesting, of course, is how Estellés puts this very much within the poetic tradition. When he considers love, he also considers its representation in verse. Here, he rejects previous versions of this and reiterates the importance of physical and emotional integrity. The fullness of the rejection is, of course, made clear in the marvellous book of Eclogues from the 1950s. Eclogue is, of course, one of the oldest genres of poetry and is thoroughly misogynistic. In a pastoral setting, two men sit and complain about their lover. They're in such a desperate state that they forget all about the daily labours, what they need to do, how they earn their living, how they should be tending their land. The treatment at the hands of this terrible woman is so desperate that all falls into rack and ruin. This is the way that woman had been represented since Theocritus in ancient Greece, through Virgil in ancient Rome, and even the age of Garcilaso de la Vega in Renaissance Castile. Curiously enough, it was this aesthetic, as understood by Garcilaso de la Vega, which was reimposed by the early years of Francoism as exemplary of truly Spanish conduct. Estellés' version of the Eclogue could not be more different. He rejects the sexist position and, updating the content, makes the experience relevant to the modern day. This is seen in the first Eclogue. First of all, the words are put in the mouth of women, not men. Women control their own discourse. The environment they inhabit is not imaginary or ideal. This is no pastoral setting, no bucolic riverside scene. We are put very much in the context of the typing pool, with its filing cabinets, sheets of paper, exactly the location where most women would work in the 1960s as typists. The previous objectification they suffered is denounced completely. And the effect is even stronger and more impactful in the seventh Eclogue. This is perhaps one of the most shocking of all Estellés' verses with regards to the female condition. What is remarkable here is that Galatea expresses herself in her own particular idiom. She is not constrained, she talks as she wants to, as a fully autonomous individual. This even extends to the way that she describes her bodily functions. Woman, of course, had been elevated to a divine status In the usual lyric of hit parade and troubadour verse, she became an angel, a sexless being, a being without a body. Galatea brings us back down to earth quite beautifully here. The vulgarity of her expression emphasizes the completeness of the female anatomy and the full function of her somatic being. She's not afraid to use language which is indecorous or shouldn't be used in decent society. This is a real statement of intent here, of woman recovering the integrity of her own bodily functions. So I'd like to pause now for a moment and just to reflect on the way that Estelies, like Fuster, transcends the limitations of his own native Valencia and demonstrates an awareness and a manner of working which is similar to his European counterparts. Remember, the ways that Vicente Andrés Estelies demythifies and deconstructs conventional values in their expression is by simple contrast of register. On the one hand, he'll take the official, standard representation of woman and how she should be loved, as defined by the eclogue and troubadour lyric, and on top of this he imposes a register which is totally out of sorts, totally incongruent with that vision, and this both subverts the restriction of the tradition itself and allows the freedom of the female to escape the bounds which are imposed upon her by such values. It's incredible to see that the major writers in the English language tradition follow exactly the same technique in their deconstruction of the values of the establishment. We can see this mainly amongst writers in Great Britain in their view to what we can call nationality or nationalism. Here, behind me on the board, you'll see what I consider to be one of the most dreadful songs in the English language. Land and Hope and Glory is full of conventional notions of patriotism. Just look at the values which are being expressed. The first one is empire and mightiness. God who made thee mighty, make thee mightier yet. At least this is dependent on justice, laws and freedom. This is extremely important in the British sense, as this is our justification for empire. We also see this as embodied in the person of the monarch, the sovereign there in the third line, who comes to represent the dignity and social values of a progressive system, and one which respects freedom. This is a consistent theme throughout representations in both poetry and song of the British imperial instinct. Even the wonderful writer William Blake was infected by such notions. He saw in his Jerusalem a reincarnation of the spirit of the Bible upon England's green and pleasant land. The countenance divine shines forth as the holy Lamb of God wanders upon our lovely pastures and meadows. This divinely inspired land, however, if we look at history, is one that's built on slavery, on rank exploitation, on colonialism. So to what extent can we take this as being an authentic interpretation of Victorian Britain? Finally, of course, we have our own national anthem. Again, we're looking at terms of might and empire. We want to send our queen or king victorious, happy and glorious. These are adjectives which belong to a different age, an age of conquest and repression and exploitation. However, there is one thing again which saves the situation to a certain extent, and this is the fact that the sovereign is the incarnation of our laws, of our decency, of our democracy. These are values which are esteemed very highly, and perhaps rightly so. The only problem is to what extent can we believe that this is a legitimate, accurate and reasonable reflection of the values of Britain? What happens, for example, if they don't represent what the establishment would like us to believe? And in 1936, as this image reveals, the British people were lucky enough to have 3 kings. Unfortunately, Edward VIII, later known as the Duke of Windsor, didn't keep the best company and had a great sympathy for fascist leader Adolf Hitler. For a country with a great belief in democracy and the rule of law, such images of the Duke of Windsor giving the fascist salute were downright distasteful, and it came as no surprise that he was duly forced to abdicate. Now, after having considered those noble, glorious, imperial values which we have expressed in the national anthem and in the patriotic verse of Blake and of Land and Hope and Glory, let's look more closely at a dissident strain which is exemplified by the modern generation of poets in the English language on our side of the Atlantic. First of all is the magnificently critical Philip Larkin. What's his view on this nobility of purpose which the establishment would like to communicate in terms of being British? His poem Annus Mirabilis destroys this completely in exactly the same way, with exactly the same strategy as the conflict in idioms, register and vocabulary as expressed by Vicente Dresses de Guess. First of all, the term Annus Mirabilis is one which is used usually by emperors, by kings, to express the wonder, the splendour of their finest years in power. The present Queen, unfortunately, experienced the opposite a number of years ago and talked about her Annus Horribilis. What does Larkin see, though? Well, this is extremely curious. After having started with a phrase of classical Latin which leads us to expect very high-flown and elevated ideas, we're reduced to an amazing, banal and straightforward expression. Sexual intercourse began in 1963. This is amazingly sardonic. We all know that that can't be the case, but it's as provocative as an aphorism by Fouster, that love is an invention of the 12th century. At all time, the great poetic instinct is being reduced by a simplicity of expression. This is anti-poetry. 1963 has no great resonance to it. What is being attacked are precisely those values, and what is being posited in its place is vulgar speech. Vulgar both in the sense of indecent, which is, as in the case of Estellés, contrary to established values, but it's also vulgar in the popular sense. The nobility, the aristocracy is being moved aside now to allow for an expression of popular culture, which is in itself typical of Estellés' expression. Now, this same literary strategy is embraced by the magnificent Irish poet Seamus Heaney. Heaney, the Nobel Prize for Literature, is from the United Kingdom, but is from a minority community in Northern Ireland which feels greater allegiance to the Republic of Ireland than to Great Britain. Some 45% of the Northern Irish population enjoy the same sentiment. But let's see how Heaney deconstructs here the magnificence of empire. First of all, we have the title, O Brave New Bull. Bull, as we can see in the image, is often a symbol of empire. This is not just Spain, of course, but John Bull typifies the breed and the power and commitment of the British imperial adventure. The title, O Brave New Bull, is, of course, rifled from a Shakespearean play. O Brave New World is the expression in The Tempest. But bull is preferred here because in colloquial English, bull means rubbish. You're talking a load of bull is the same as saying you're talking a load of rubbish. So right from the title, Heaney has begun his deconstruction of the magnificence of empire. And what incident is the poet narrating here? Well, the choice amongst the local Irish population to use a bull for reproduction which is not licensed. With this unlicensed nature, this illegal procedure presents an alternative to the official legal authority, which represents those values of Britishness which are usually communicated. The similarity in technique and intention then between Estellés, Larkin and Heaney is palpable. These three magnificent writers play around with authority, with the establishment, with establishment values, with convention in writing, in order to offer an alternative view.